Well, with that in mind, let's proceed to the theme of today's gathering. As you know, it was built around the need to provide care and support for loved ones, in some instances, parents. Tony Giles has responded to that theme uniquely so. Don't think he needs any introduction by me, but let me just bring to your attention Tony, somebody I have known for a long time. I can remember at groups where his dad would ask us to pray for his son who was in seminary and then beginning his ministry. Tony is a native of Middle Tennessee, graduated from Hillsborough High School. Hillwood High School. I knew that. That came out wrong. Hillwood High School in West Nashville. Went to Vanderbilt, graduated from Vanderbilt University with a Bachelor of Arts degree, and to Reform Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, with a Master's in Divinity. He served for, 24 years at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Charlottesville, Virginia, which I must confess is not one of my favorite locations today. The inside to that is I'm a Vanderbilt fan, and the University of Virginia interfered with Vanderbilt repeating as the national baseball champions. But I'm distracted. Tony spent a number of years in Charlottesville serving with the Trinity Presbyterian Church along a number of callings, children, youth, college, adults, and served for a period of time as an interim pastor, senior pastor there, as that congregation was looking for a senior pastor. When his parents had specific needs, he interrupted his career there, came back to Middle Tennessee to care for them. He served for a period of time as an associate pastor, 2 years at Grace Presbyterian Church, and then again, as you know, from your own experience, he served us so exceedingly well during a period of crisis here as the interim senior pastor. He's now an assistant pastor at Cornerstone in downtown Nashville, and is also, and this is Franklin, thank you. He is serving with McGowan Search with Charles McGowan in an endeavor to assist churches around the country in finding a pastor to call to meet their specific needs. So without any further ado, would you join me in welcoming back here Tony Giles. Tony?
I knew what David was doing last night. He was doing what I was doing, watching Game 3 of the College World Series. And I did get a few texts during the game from a few Virginia friends wanting to know who I was cheering for. And I said black and gold, no doubt, in my mind. But that story began, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a window into that story, our Charlottesville years, as a lead-in to our topic today. Beach Week is the week between exams and graduation, a lot of places. And at the University of Virginia, that was always the second week of May, the second full week of May. And if you think about it, that falls at another significant kind of part of the year for many. Hold on to that thought in a second. But typically, what the students would scatter as soon as exams were over. And I was asked 1 year to make that trip with them and be their speaker at Beach Week. They would gather together and they'd have some large fellowship teaching meetings in a beach house. They'd show all the furniture aside and cram way too many people in there for the owner's pleasure. But that began a string of years making a trip from Charlottesville, Virginia. After I'd go to the worship service, I'd jump in a packed, loaded car and drive Interstate 64 to Richmond and sometimes beyond, and then get on state roads and make our way to the Outer Banks of North Carolina for Beach Week. The second Sunday of May. So for 17 years, I jumped in a loaded car on the second Sunday of May and drove east thinking of my mother who was west. And I would always make the phone call somewhere along the way or after I got there. And after the first couple of years, I noticed that this path that had become so familiar to me, I would see little gatherings outside in the front yard or sometimes the backyard of families gathering together on these little back roads now near the beach in Virginia and then North Carolina celebrating Mother's Day. I tell you that because somewhere along the way, I began to note how significant that date was. I had always observed it in a fashion, and it was important enough, it was growing enough to me that by the time I got there on a Sunday night, I introduced to this room full of college students a Beach Week survival kit that I started bringing every year. And it included the toothbrush that they forgot, some sunscreen, some aloe for those that got carried away, and a Mother's Day card and a stamp. And there was always somebody there to take it. And I tell you that because over the course of those 17 trips to the beach, I began to realize and think about when was the last time I was able to spend Mother's Day with my mother. We were in Charlottesville 24 years, and I'm working with college students most of those years. And for 17 years in a row, I was on a beach in North Carolina rather than somewhere in West Meade. There was one exception. We surprised her. We connived with my dad, and we showed up at. We were parked seated at a table in an O'Charlie's restaurant on White Bridge Road with menus over our heads. When Dad walked through the doors with my mother, we dropped the menus, and she shrieked in delight. One exception. But those trips planted a seed that really began to unfold when that led to a decision that we made to sell a house in Virginia and move to Nashville. My story is unique. I've told people for every person that does what we did, there are 8 to 10 probably that do it the other way around, that find a place in their community that is a place where those parents can reside and get the care. And there was a lot of reasons I won't go into, but that did not seem to be a real viable option for us. But normally, that's the first consideration, and we did consider that. In talking to my mother's and then my mother's and my father's geriatric psychiatrist, who was fascinated by our story for 2 reasons. One was a husband and wife going through dementia-related diseases together. That's kind of rare in and of itself. I had not considered how rare that was, but he was intrigued by this story for that reason, and also that it was the son that had relocated. And he said, from his experience, for every one son that does that, there's 24 daughters that do that. And I hadn't thought about that, but he was very intrigued by our story. But ours is unique. But as unique as our story is, it's a common experience. And some of you already have stories I've heard just as we were waiting around, hearing some of the things you're dealing with or will be dealing with. And it's very, very common. The uniqueness of our story was our situations, our abilities, and in a moment in time where, as Mary Lynn and I weighed all of the factors, we determined before God that this would be a right and good thing to do, to relocate. I want to not miss this point. There's some handouts in the middle of the table, and some of this will overlap. I'm not going to stick very tightly to this, but I'll tell you what it is all there on the paper before we finish. And I do want to, I'm going to leave some time for some questions. Not that I'm an answer bank on any of these things. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a counselor. I'm a son of parents with a story that I'm happy to share. But one of the things I've noted is, as common as the story is, there are way, way too many people dealing with this, living through this story in a vacuum or as in a silo. In fact, that's the norm, it seems, where people are trying to learn things, figure things out, get some insight into what the resources are, the decisions that are to be made. And you start with your computer, maybe, or maybe somebody, a friend that's gone through something similar, but there's so much that can be shared together into a common understanding of what does it mean. And the church is in a grand position to do that. There's no better made arena for that dialogue, and to see you gathered around this topic today is a good thing. My hope is that something will come out of this, and if nothing else, at least a common dialogue that you can have with one another about the things that you're facing as an individual, thinking about your own family situation, or maybe your situation, not too far away, but that you can have a common dialogue and that it becomes a safe thing to talk about and a good thing to talk about. Somebody made the observation once that in Victorian England, they were so reluctant and prudish to talk about intimate matters like sexuality. We don't have that problem in this culture, but we don't talk about death, and we don't talk about aging, and we're as prudish or as reluctant to enter into this thing. You've heard the expression, well, as long as you have your health, the one thing you're going to lose. It's just ironic that this becomes something, it's not yet become something that is a common dialogue that we have together. More on that some other time. But I wanted you to think about this and you can go back with me to a day probably 8 or 9 years ago now when Mary Lynn and I were having this discussion. We were empty nesters. We had been in one place for 24 years. And a friend of mine said, Tony, if you are serious about relocating, leaving something as familiar and comfortable and predictable as your life here in Charlottesville, you're going to have to trust God more. And I think that's when we knew that was the right thing to do. Because we didn't know what the cost was going to be, but we knew it would be at a price. And we had no idea really what we were stepping into. The circumstances were these. My mother had developed, she had a long history, lots of kinds of things that were being treated medically with prescriptions: high blood pressure, depression, cholesterol, 2 or 3 more things. And then layered on top of that was some vascular dementia that had begun to show itself. She ended up in the emergency room. Quick trip from Virginia. We learned that she had been probably over-medicated. What we were watching from a distance is my dad was her chief provider, caregiver, health monitor, a retired accountant who had this elaborate, sophisticated, but simplified, but very orderly. I would call it a spreadsheet, but it was done with ink and pen and a ruler. But a spreadsheet of medications, the dates and dosages and things like that. And every visit we made, things looked good. He was certainly on top of things the way that we would have wanted them to be. What we didn't know was that he was developing Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, I've learned, is present before it shows up, maybe as many as 10 years. And so we were not monitoring, or we were not present enough to see things that somebody might have seen, but her chief caregiver was growing increasingly unable to give the care that she needed. So we don't know what the story really was, except she ended up in the emergency room. She was very reluctant to take all these pills, just kind of by nature. All of us should have a little caution at taking pill after pill after pill. But doctors were monitoring it, but she had more than one doctor. We weren't really clear that all the doctors knew what the others, were prescribing and watching how they interacted. And so she was rightly cautious, and he was increasingly frustrated with her reluctance or her hesitation. So we don't know why she ended up in the emergency room. The physicians thought they were treating somebody that was over-medicated, but they kept her in the psychiatric wing at St. Thomas Hospital in order to monitor those medications and to adjust them and to kind of see what she needed and didn't need. And she was there for a matter of weeks. We didn't stay the whole time. I was back in Virginia. We came back near her discharge, and a doctor walked in the room and said, "How long has she been diagnosed with Parkinson's?" And we said, "Never heard that." And it was in the Parkinson's family, but it was close enough that the only medications to prescribe were for Parkinson's. This was similar, but not quite the target. And so she continued a life that was less than full and less than ideal, but she spent some time in a skilled nursing facility to learn how able she was going to be able to function on her own, back in her own home. The decision was made by the physician. The strong recommendation was she wouldn't be able to go back and live right now without some kind of assistance, and we weren't sure Dad was going to be able to provide that. So Brighton Gardens, Maryland Farms, was our solution for 6 months. Dad was still driving at that point. That's another story. But he would jump in the car, go back to the home in Westmead, which we kept, and spend the day there, picking up sticks in the yard, mowing the yard, doing his laundry, buying groceries, abandoning his wife in the process. He was still writing the checks at that point, and we wanted him to be able to do everything that he could do. But our first real clue about the progression of the disease for him was when he wouldn't accept the information that there were funds that I was transferring, his funds, moving into a checking account for him to keep writing these big monthly checks. He didn't know that he had resources that he had. And that was, again, more of the story of this unfolding. We were watching this occur. Let me just fast forward. We ended up moving them back into their home. We were living here at that time and felt like if they were back in their home that was familiar and with the kind of diseases that they were both living through, familiarity is everything, and sometimes it's the only thing. So back in the home made all the sense, but that's when we knew it was going to cost us more than we had planned. And I don't mean dollars. I just mean time and investment. I was living in Brentwood, still am. That's in Westmead. And over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, I was making sometimes 5 trips a week over there, and that is with caregivers in the home. We built a team. We tried agencies with limited success. The best resolution in our case was it was word-of-mouth references, and we got a hold of 2 or 3 eventually women that formed a 3-person team caring eventually around the clock with my mother and then caring for my dad when he didn't realize they were caring for him as well. And that worked. with a lot of work. But our circumstances, their needs, and the margin that it called on was significant and part of our dilemma, as we were trying to think it through. We learned that it was one of the hardest things and one of the best things. We have no regrets that this was a choice that we made to come back. Mary Lynn is from here as well. She has an elderly mother who's healthy, still living and healthy, older than both my parents. But after 4 years, Mom died, and then last summer, Dad did as well. So it was just God's way of working in us and inside of us and even through us. But a choice that we made that we felt like was the right one given our circumstances, and filled with all kinds of strains and disappointments. I never expected to hear or see things occur that did. And without going into more detail than I need to, it included being yelled out of the house by my father on Christmas Day, who had no idea what was going on in his inside of himself, no recollection of it. That's the day we gave caregivers off, and so what for me it meant on holidays, that's where I was, usually alone, with both parents for a while, and then eventually with Dad alone, at some cost, but it was a cost worthwhile. I wanted to start with this, and I failed to, but here's part of what led us down this road. I've printed this, I think, on your handout. It's these words from Ephesians 5. This is how we process this and what led us down this particular road. Have I got that in front? Is it on there? I selected verses. I've run them together into one paragraph just so you see the things that jumped out at me as we were making this decision. Look carefully then how you walk, not as unwise but as wise, making the best use of the time because the days are evil. Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Be filled with the Spirit, giving thanks always for everything to God the Father in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then you will recognize it probably, but then he talks about different categories of people, and here's one that landed in front of us. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. It was an attempt to honor parents, to find ways to love them in ways that were significant, at a significant cost to us, but given the circumstances of our life, it was a cost. It was something that we could afford in that regard. It was a high price that we could afford, and we chose to do that. I've written down 4. I won't go into too much here, just to give you some handles on it. Here were some things that became principles for us as we were thinking about it. Family was one. What does it mean to honor and love parents? What does it mean to offer care with the hope that it would be received instead of imposed? Sometimes there's a kind of care that needs to be imposed, and near the end, my dad's care was imposed, but at this critical juncture, it needed to be something that they would receive. I had to consider my wife. It's my parents we're talking about. And so this became a mutual decision, a commitment that we were both making to enter into this together, to roll up our sleeves. It was some cost to her. She was coming home too, so it was not like without some benefit. but it was a joint mutual decision that we had to work through, talk through, pray through, consider the ramifications for all of us, not just for me. So family was one guiding principle. Capacity. Do I have the capacity to do this? And that's what made my story unique, I think. I was at a place where I could and chose to. I made the margin that I didn't have. Ironically or providentially, the needs were lesser when I landed at Christ Community. And I've thought about it a lot. I couldn't have fulfilled the role here 6 months earlier because of the intensity of what it demanded. And in God's way of orchestrating things, I had the margin when I needed it and was able to give energy and time to parents that needed it. The others are pretty straightforward. It was the dignity. How do you guard the dignity and maintain the dignity, recognizing that my parents made in the image of God, they're unique individuals. And as we read in Proverbs 20, the glory of young men is their strength, but the splendor of old men is their gray hair. There's no guarantee that that's really what results with gray hair or old age, but it's meant to come. There's a form of glory that's meant to come with old age. And we wanted to give ourselves to seeing that occur, and it meant creative ways of coming alongside them, protecting their dignity, meeting their needs, trying to find ways to extend a life that's enjoyable for them as long as we could. I've listed, and I'm going to go through all this, is probably maybe the most beneficial thing, the things I'm going to skip, but it's in writing. And some of them will need a little bit of explanation, and some of them might be the specific questions that you have. I'll mention a couple of these, and then you can read through these later on your own, and I'm happy to talk later or even another day about any of these. But there were very practical things that this called for. We had to figure out, how do we handle this car key question? David's a part of the story. The Bill Wilkerson Center at Vanderbilt here has a occupational therapy driving program that when you begin to receive Aricept for memory loss and dementia kind of related things, your doctor can recommend that, and insurance covers the large proportion of the cost of a driving assessment, which meant that somebody besides the doctor or the family is making the call on car keys. David's part of the story was my dad's first visit down there was when we were in Virginia, and I couldn't get back for it. He drove and sat through the assessment, and you have to go back every year as long as you're on this medication. So I took the next trip, and Dad did better than we thought the first trip. He did worse than we feared the second. And the second trip, he left with notification that he was no longer a driver. That took the decision out of us, out of our hands. If you're dealing with parents in another location besides Nashville, I don't know what those other options might be, but there may be some similar things worth exploring. That by itself didn't solve the car issue. We had there's a lot of layers to this story, but at least took the big decision away. Then we had to implement it, and that took some creativity. But I started going to doctor's appointments with my parents to gather the information that I couldn't rely on them to be accurately reporting. There's a cost. I had to get access to their medical history. It's amazing how little I knew about their medical history. It's remarkable. I don't think about. I mean, I didn't. I don't think about my parents' medical history. I needed to, and I hadn't. And I had a lot of homework on that one. You have to pay attention to how does the particular illness or disease progress, and what are the things you need to be watching for if you're the caregiver. I'm so glad my dad took the initiative, and one of the things I want to suggest today is if this has not occurred, this is something that would be could be a front burner for you if you're dealing with aging parents, or even if you're considering the day when your children will care for you, to consider how important it is to deal with some of the financial records and getting your name on those accounts and the ability to manage things for them when that day comes. My dad was as proactive as he knew to be on those things, and had his attorney friend draw up some of those papers that served us very well. A revocable living trust, is one. For the advanced directive, end-of-life decisions, those kinds of things are things that you need to be doing yesterday in this whole arena. My dad was willing to share financial information. Here are the documents. Here are the accounts. He was very clear. Not all dads, I realize, are like that, but that's an important piece of this whole transition. My dad thought he had a pretty decent long-term care policy. Turned out it wasn't, and it's just good to have 2 or 3 sets of eyes on some of those things to see are there provisions in place that are going to be sufficient. We informed the neighbors. We let the neighbors know what was going on. They had some great neighbors who kept one eye on the house, and my dad, when he was doing some questionable things. I got a phone call from a bank teller one day and said, "There's a man here who wants to talk to you." I said, "Okay." I'm here I'm standing here with your dad, and there's a guy who wants money. He has just resurfaced your driveway, and your dad gave him permission to resurface the driveway, and now he wants his money. Well, Dad hadn't written a check in a year, didn't even have a checkbook, and so we had to untangle that. And I say that just because the telephone solicitations, the knock on the door, those are the kinds of things you just got to anticipate, plan for, and figure out. What do you do in those situations? We thought about putting a security camera in the house. We never got that far, but I told somebody would say, "How are things at your parents?" This was before we had round the clock caregivers, and I said, "Well, I really don't know." I mean, they may be okay, but at one point it felt like having a 6 and 7-year-old in a house on the other side of town. They may be okay, but you really don't know. And that's when we really thought about the security camera, just so that we could monitor things from a distance. But taking those kinds of things into consideration was part of the difficulty. My sister found this one. I put this website in here. It's the Tennessee Aging and Disability Resource Center. She learned that this outfit and others like it will do this service. There's a little sticker that goes on the front of your door to alert the rescue squad, if they're ever called, that, yes, all that information that you need is in one place, and it's a folder, and it's on a magnet on the refrigerator with all those medical pieces of information, HIPAA decisions and things like that, allergies, list of medications, that's the specific practical things that we really figured out was important. I'm going to stop here in just a second and let you ask some questions, but here's one that I heard often, and I was asking, it was my own question: how will you know when it's time to move from a home where things are familiar into more care? And the answer I kept getting from the physician was, "You'll know." There's no one answer to that, but in hindsight, he was right twice with both Mom and Dad. You will know. It will become that evident. And I can tell details if you're interested some other time. But here's another thing that I would urge you as a son or a daughter thinking about caring for parents. I asked this question once long before we moved to Nashville. So what will you regret if you never get to do with your dad? I don't know where that question came from. I don't know if I made it up or heard it, but I was kind of stuck on that one for a while. David's a part of this story too, because there was one answer. It was to go to St. Louis and watch the Cardinals. He had grown up a Cardinals fan, and he had made me one, and we'd never been together. And I called him and said, "Hey, what about?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, who might go with you?" And he said, "Well, David would go." And David and a couple of us jumped in the car with Dad and drove to St. Louis for an overnight trip. What will you regret if you never do with them? But I've thought about, too, what will you regret if you never tell them? And that became more and more the question for me in these last several years with them after we moved back. And I made it a point to say words that I didn't hear. They didn't hear from me often enough, and frankly, I didn't hear from them. My dad, in particular, he grew up in a generation. You recognize this. I rarely heard the words "I love you," but I managed to kind of crawl past that in the last year. I think that I was making those trips to Westmead, and then eventually the Barton House in Bellevue. I always made a point to say, "I love you." Don't know what he really grasped at that point. It's funny now, but his response was, "Well, okay." But that was my dad. What will you regret doing? What will you regret telling them? And then I heard this countless times, enough that I really need to tell you this as well. You do need to take care of yourself in this. If you're a caregiver, you've got to find ways to take care of yourself. I'm going to stop here. There's a couple of things I want to say when I conclude, but we're running out of time, I realize. But if there's anything that's kind of a burning question that you might have, or anything that I've skipped over or touched on that would be that you want to ask, I'm happy to hear that. I'm not an expert, as I said. And if not, I've got some other things to say. But anybody? Yeah, you're right. She said, the question was, you gave up a lot for your career. Financially, it was difficult, and it's not been easy in response. And I think the bottom line is we just knew we'd have to trust God, and we've paid bills. There are things that we we're not able to, we've had to cut back on a lot of things, and there's some things that we can't do. Our mortgage is a lot longer term than we wish, at this stage of the game. We know that we're probably going to have to downsize. So far, we haven't. I don't know that we could save a lot of money in purchasing a new home today that's smaller. So we like where we are, but He's been faithful. After 24 years in one church, in 6 years here, I've been in 4. And 2 of those I knew were temporary, including this one. But it's just, I don't know. It's just we've been willing to trust God with that, and God's provided sufficiently. It's not what it was, but there's a sense in which our expenses are less a little bit, but still, God's been faithful, I guess is all I would say. Well, that's a good transition. Did you hear the question is, what do you wish your parents had done that would have made it easier? The irony is, Dad thought he had done everything. He had remodeled their bedroom to allow for a hospital bed because his parents had their mothers die in the house. And that was the story. He thought he had done everything he needed to do. He had a cancer policy he never used. He was proactive. But the thing that the thing I think that they could have done that would have them moving to Charlottesville was not an option in their minds, particularly his. I think my mother would have come. It would have been hard. But I think part of what would help would be able to think outside the box a little bit. He watched his grandmother die in his parents' home, and that was the story that he planned for. But to recognize that there are a lot of other ways. He should have not relied on his own ability to assess this long-term care policy. He should have gotten more, had some other set of eyes take a look at it. He was progressive about getting proactive about getting my signature on things. That was very helpful. But in terms of here's the and this may be a good place to land this plane. One of the things I wanted to say to you is if you're willing to prepare to receive the help that some of you are giving, one of the things that you can do, and I hope I will do, is, and this is on your handout, practice weakness. Practice needing help. My dad was not very good at receiving help, and my mother would receive it, but she'd much rather give it. But it's something that we can do is practice receiving it. I've put down here, the truth is, and wisdom knows that we're weak, and we can practice that now. Asking for and receiving help from God and from each other, to let someone drive for you, to let someone help you cross the street if you don't need the help, but to practice receiving that help. And as Christians, it's been said that we are the most realistic about that. And to step into that, asking for help is a form of courage, and be unafraid to let others help. That I hope that I will grow in that direction, and that would have made things a little smoother, a little easier. Take the initiative. You take the initiative in talking to your children about these things. Say, hey, you know what? You're going to need to know these things, and you're going to need to, if not care for me, at least be able to make some decisions for me. There will be a time when I can't make all these decisions. And make that as easy a conversation as it'll be difficult for everybody, but you can make it easier on children by having that discussion with them. So I guess those are a couple things I think of.
In relationship to her question, Sue and I used to talk about the fact that we would never fully understand our folks for two reasons. One is depression, the other was World War II. And then, I think in some regards, folks of that generation, you didn't talk about him, you didn't talk about him.
Yeah.
Pop would blow up when I asked him about mine. And it was his secret, it's my money, it's none of your business. So, for a good long time, good Scotty and I had to deal with, that was just him. They grew up like that.
Yeah.
Pop was extremely poor family and ran away from home and figured out how he was not going to be like that. But it was going to be on his terms. His terms, in some regards, pretty private. So,
Yeah.
if you might have wanted, we might have wanted a little bit more conversation there.
Yeah, that's true. And through that experience, you can turn the table. I mean, you can rewrite that script, for your children. And as Christians, we can and should be able to have those kinds of discussions in a better, healthier way. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, in some ways, would it have been easier? Yeah, would it have been easier for us had my parents been able or willing to relocate? In a sense, yes, but I've got to. It's hypothetical, and I've got to kind of think about it. And I haven't thought about that very much. I don't know. At the time that move would have occurred, my mother would have been kind of housebound. My dad just kind of restless, and it may have been difficult for us to monitor him in a good way in a strange place for him. So I think every situation is different. I think oftentimes our willingness to relocate can and should be on the table. Should we be the ones? Meaning, as the parents, I'm thinking about our daughters right now. What will we do one day? My hope is that they'll be in some place with roots that we could. You don't want to follow a child or daughter around who's transient themselves. So every situation is a little different. Had they said, "Hey, we're thinking about moving to Virginia," we would have welcomed that. But it just wasn't going to happen. That's why every story is unique. But had they been willing, should we be willing to relocate? I'm thinking that maybe we should. I hope that we would be in 20 years or however long that takes. It might be next year, but you don't know how our health is going to play out, do we? I mean, we know that death is on the table. We know aging is. We're going to lose the health we do have. Tomorrow might be different, for all of us. Plan accordingly. Just kind of get your ducks in a row as best you can, financially, medically, and other ways. Let me just land this here. I've thought about this one too. This is from Isaiah. We'll close with this, and I'll pray for us. This is from Isaiah, and this is kind of the big story. I mean, there's a bigger story that we know. We know how the story ends, and Revelation tells us that story. But listen to these words that address me and my gray hair, as I think about my parents, the end of their lives in this world. Here's what God says. "Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born by me, carried by me from before your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age, I am he. And to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made you, I will bear you, I will carry and will save you." That story, that reality shapes the way you enter into those years. It also enters in the way, as believers, you can carry parents, particularly if they're believers. Dying well has everything to do with the state of your soul. And my hope is that I'm ready to die well because of the state of my soul. Not because there are things that I've checked everything off that bucket list. I don't even have a bucket list. Nothing against bucket lists, but my hope is in another narrative, not in a checklist. And I want. There's some things I haven't done. I've yet to see the Grand Canyon. I hope to see the Grand Canyon. But if I don't see the Grand Canyon, I will die well. Tim Corbin, after the game last night, said about this team that he's coached, he said, if I die tomorrow, I'll be okay. And it wasn't because they missed the golden ring of a second crown. It's because of what he had watched occur. He was talking about his players, his team. And I would hope I'd be able to say that about my life and my family. I don't know if he was talking about the state of his soul when he said that. He was talking about what he had hoped to get out of life he had gotten from this team that played so well and so closely together. And I want to be able to say that about my own life, that I'm ready. I can die well because of the one who carries me. And that is the greatest contribution you'll make to your children, is to be able to convey to them that you're ready to die well. And we do that knowing that God is the one who knows the number of our days. I hope that my parents' last days were better than they would have been had I not been in the story. I think they were, but that was our choice, our circumstances to make that call and that decision. But even if it doesn't require a move for you, it will require a price. And it's a price that you can afford when you know that God is the one who holds you and is providing for you. And yeah, we'll probably pay next month's bills because it's his story. I'll end there, and happy to linger and talking about any particular things if you want to, but
Tony, I was surprised by how deeply emotional your remarks impacted me. Reliving some of that myself, I didn't expect that. Frank Giles, who is Dad, and Mary Ellen were friends of Beverly's and mine for, I guess 30 years, near neighbors, attended the same church for a long time. And his dad, Frank, was in a Bible study that I was a part of beginning in about 1983. So with that as a background and the standing for being able to say two things, from up very close and quite personal, I observed Tony as he so sacrificially and well loved his parents. The word would be well done. I don't think there's anything else, and as Frank's friend, I so very much appreciated how you cared for him and for your mother. It was an exceedingly great model, and thank you. And the second thing that occurs to me, I did experience Frank as a World War II veteran. He was a bombardier and a navigator in a B-17. I mean, I've seen pictures of him in his uniform. He experienced things that those of us who were not active in the service at that time did not experience. And so, Gary Cooper may be our model. Silence is... do you remember Gary Cooper? I'm sure if he had lived today and modeled that, he would have spent a lot of sessions in therapy with his wife. But what I want to say is that when it came to prayer time and specific requests in the prayer group in which your father participated, there is not much question, as he shared about you, his great pride and respect for you and what you were doing, and his request that we pray for you in support, very clearly and loudly said to each one of us, I love that boy. So, you hear it now. Thank you all so very much. I hope this has been a good time for you. It's been a great message and a good start. Please sign up as you leave, if you haven't, for the other activities that we have mentioned. Leave your name tags there. If you've got an opportunity and want a service, leave your name with Marty. If you will, as we conclude, let's stand and sing our theme song. We'll try